brewers, and welcome to the latest episode of Beers in My Backyard. It's been a pretty productive weekend too, because I've just put down my latest brew, which is a blonde ale. First time that I've tried this, getting it ready before my father-in-law comes to visit in roughly a month's time, and I thought, let's surprise him, let's get some beer ready. And while I was putting it together, I thought, yeah, you know what, I'm going to take some pictures, a little bit of video along the way too, and create a quick and dirty guide, very basic really, just pointing out what's involved in a bit of a brew in the bag beer situation. So if you're thinking, I've heard about this, I'm keen to try it, I'm not exactly sure what's involved, well, these are a few of the steps. It's not the definitive guide by any means, but it's a little rough and ready guide to what's involved. It's more time consuming than difficult, that's the good thing, and this is how we went.
Now, our very first step before we get cooking, before we get brewing, before we start throwing hops and grains and bits and pieces everywhere, and it's one of the most important things in your brewing process too, getting everything ready. And when I mean ready, I mean nice and clean and sterilized and good to go. Because if you skip on this step, if you skimp on this step, you're going to run into dramas later on. You're going to get bacteria into your beer and it's going to ruin your batch. All of that hard work will go right down the sinkhole because you didn't spend the time getting things ready. So what I've done is a good soaking with the Steriphos, which I talked about in my very first episode of Beers in My Backyard. It's soaked for roughly 14 hours. It's come out with some crud that I couldn't even see before, so it's done a really good clean. I've given everything a nice wash, and I mean everything. The brew pot, the brew bags, the testing gear to find out the original gravity, that's got to clean as well. Anything that is going to be touching the beer, from the little stop at the top of the carboy to the hose that I'm using as a siphon, all of that kind of stuff, if it's touching the beer, it needs to be cleaned. It needs to be sterilized. This is an absolutely important step. Okay, so now that we have our gear all nice and clean, in fact, cleaner than it's ever been before, our next step is to get everything ready for the mash step. Now, this is where we take all of the grains that we're using in our all-grain brew, we pour them in a bag, and it could be a hop sock, or it could be an even bigger bag, or it could be some cheesecloth wrap, however you want to do it, and we're going to give it a really, really warm bath. We're not boiling it, we're not cooking it, we are steeping it for an hour to get some of the sugars and everything that we need out of the milled grain and into the liquid. So we're going to chuck in a couple of litres of water. Depending on your recipe, of course, always consult your recipe for how much water you're going to need. Warm up some water, get the bag in there, and start mashing for an hour. So an hour later, our mash step is done. Our water has now turned into a sweet wort. And what we're going to do now is we're going to add additional water, depending on your recipe. It'll tell you exact quantities. And we're going to run it through the grain bag suspended up the top here so that it can bring out even more of those fermentable sugars that we need for this brew. So this is called sparging. A few different ways that you can do this. I like to suspend things and run water through, but you can also push on the bag too. I suggest using some gloves for this. It might get a little bit too hot if you're just using your bare fingers, but just to milk out that extra fermentable sugars that are going to go into our brew. Now that we've got enough of the sugars out of the grain, now that we've got enough water as the recipe has told us we need to use, we can ditch the grains. That's done. We are only dealing with the wort from now on. And we need to get this to a rolling boil so that it churns over and just gets everything right through it, all cooked up to the levels that it needs to be, and begin this wonderful beer making process. So depending on your cooking situation, you might be doing this inside on a gas burner. You may have an induction cooktop like I do at my house, which is rubbish for the pot that I'm using, so I have to use the barbecue outside. It's entirely up to you, but you want to hit it with a hot flame and get it up and boiling. Consult your recipe as to when the hop additions, if any, are going to go into your beer and add them at the according time. And when the boil time is done, time to turn off the heat, time to remove the hops, unless the recipe tells you to keep them in there, and time to get this cooled down in as quick a way as possible. Now, there are a few different ways that you can do this. People have used copper coils to cool it down. People have used blast fridges. Many different techniques out there. You may let it sit for a couple of hours. You may use running water around the outside of the pot. Heaps of different ways, and lots of stuff on YouTube too if you're looking for ways to chill down your beer. Now, once you get your wort down to a workable temperature, and that is, it's not going to burn you if you touch it with your exposed skin. It's also not going to crack any of your glass equipment. It's not that hot. Well, couple more steps to go before we wrap up our brew day. Step number 1 is to get an original gravity reading. This is so we can calculate our alcohol by volume at the end of it. So what we do is we pop in a sample into the hydrometer chamber or vial or however you want to do it. In goes the stick. Grab that reading, write it down. You're going to be using it later. Step number 2, of course, once it's cool enough, we are going to pitch in our yeasties. We don't want it so hot that it actually rules them out and makes them ineffective when they're thrown in the batch. Now, there's a few different ways of doing this. You can search for pitching yeast through YouTube. Some people like to make a yeast starter. Some people just throw it into the mix when it's cool enough. Either way seems to work for me. It's entirely up to your own preference. So now that your yeasties are in the mix, your little sample from the hydrometer chamber is back in the carboy as well. Time to give things a nice, good shake to agitate everything. Then you pop on the bung, pop on your airlock, or in my case, I'm using a blow-off tube for the first couple of days, into a small bottle of something like vodka or food-grade sanitizing solution. Star San is also a good choice. And there you have it. Our brew in the bag, basic session, done and dusted. And it wasn't that hard, was it? Just time-consuming. Now to let the fermentation process do its thing, eventually bottle it, throw it in the fridge for a bit, and tuck into some tasty home-brewed beers.